The second time I heard my name disappear from the recital board, I was standing in the north corridor of Reborn Conservatory with my violin case pressed against my ribs and a memory of dying still cold under my skin. The notice board outside the Grand Aurelia Hall was surrounded by students in black concert clothes, all of them leaning forward as the assistant registrar pinned the final program for the Winter Laureate recital beneath the glass. In my first life, that little brass key had opened the door to humiliation. In this life, it sounded like the opening note of a trap. My slot had been 7th, after the flute concerto and before the closing piano quartet, the exact place every serious performer wanted because the donor committee would be awake, the critics would not yet be bored, and the live stream numbers would be highest. My name should have been printed there beside Saint Saëns, Introduction and Rondo Capriccioso, Solo Violin, Leora Vane. Instead, when the registrar stepped back and the crowd surged close, I saw another name sitting in the spotlight that had once belonged to me. Evelyn Caro. Same piece. Same accompanist. Same 7-minute slot. The only thing missing was my future. Behind me, someone gasped like they had seen a body. Someone else whispered that Evelyn had finally done it, that the scholarship girl from the old East Wing had taken the golden stage from the dean's favorite orphan. I did not correct them. I did not claw through the crowd. I did not slam my palm against the glass until everyone turned around, the way I had done in my first life when panic had made me look guilty before I even knew the charge. I only stood there, feeling the old timeline press its mouth against my ear, and watched Evelyn's reflection appear in the glass beside mine. She wore pearl earrings, a cream cashmere coat, and the small, wounded smile she used whenever she wanted witnesses. "Leora," she whispered, soft enough to sound afraid and loud enough for the nearest students to hear. "I'm so sorry. They told me you withdrew." In my first life, I had shouted that I never withdrew, that she had stolen my slot, my accompaniment track, and the annotated score only I had marked with red pencil. In my first life, she had widened her eyes until tears gathered like dew, and 30 students had watched me become the jealous girl who could not bear to lose. This time, I looked at her reflection instead of her face and smiled as if she had handed me flowers. "Then you should play beautifully," I said. The corridor went silent in the way a string goes silent right before it snaps. Evelyn blinked once, and for the first time since my rebirth, I saw fear move under her skin. I had returned to life at 6:11 that morning, flat on the floor of practice room B19, with the sour smell of rosin dust in my mouth and the old radiator hissing beside my ear. The last thing I remembered from my first life was the scream of a train entering the underground platform at midnight, my recital dress soaked from winter rain, my scholarship revoked, my name removed from the conservatory alumni record, and Evelyn's winning encore playing from someone's phone behind me while strangers stepped around my collapsed violin case. It had not been a dramatic death. There had been no curse, no thunder, no hand reaching from heaven. There had only been exhaustion, fever, shame, and the dull understanding that everything I had built since childhood had been taken by a girl who knew how to cry in public and lie in private. My first life ended after the disciplinary panel found me responsible for performance sabotage because resin had been smeared inside Evelyn's bow hair before her stolen performance, because a forged withdrawal form carried my signature, because an anonymous email from my account accused her of plagiarism in language so cruel it sounded exactly like the person she wanted them to believe I was. I had been suspended for the rest of the term, lost the Mendelssohn Fellowship, lost my place at the European Summer Academy, and lost the only teacher who had ever believed my hands could carry me farther than my family name ever had. The cruelest part was not that Evelyn became the Winter Laureate. It was that she played badly. She played my piece with my fingerings, my tempo map, my bowing decisions, and still made it sound like a polished window with no house behind it. The critics called her technically secure but emotionally restrained. The donor committee did not care. Her mother bought flowers, the dean applauded, and the world moved on without asking why my music had vanished from my own mouth. When I woke in B19 again, 7 days before the recital, my first instinct was to grab my violin and run to the registrar before Evelyn could touch anything. Then the clock on the wall coughed through its second hand, and memory arrived in layers so sharp they almost cut me open. 7 days. The forged withdrawal form had not yet been filed. The anonymous email had not yet been sent. The bow hair had not yet been ruined. The accompanist had not yet been bribed to claim I missed rehearsals. I remembered all of it now, not like a dream, but like a score I had spent years memorizing note by note. I remembered that Evelyn had not worked alone. She had borrowed my keycard from our shared studio under the excuse of fetching her metronome. She had copied my competition passport from the printer tray. She had taken photographs of my annotated score when I ran to the bathroom during chamber class. She had convinced Professor Soren, my own mentor, that I was mentally unstable after a breakdown she staged by spilling tea on my concerto manuscript and recording only my reaction. She had told the assistant registrar that I had confided in her about stage fright and suicidal thoughts, words so poisonous and intimate that no administrator dared ignore them. In my first life, every defense I made sounded desperate because the evidence had already been arranged into a cage before I realized I was inside it. But rebirth did not bring me mercy. It brought me timing. So I sat up slowly, felt the old ache in my left wrist, looked at the cracked mirror above the practice room sink, and asked the girl reflected there the only question that mattered. If they had built a cage for me once, why not let them build the same cage again and step into it themselves? The first thing I did was not protect my recital slot. That would have been too small. Protecting the slot would save one performance, one evening, one review. I wanted the whole rotten wing of the conservatory to collapse where everyone could see the termites crawling out. Reborn Conservatory was famous for two things: producing international prize winners and burying scandals beneath velvet curtains. Evelyn's family had funded the restoration of the Grand Aurelia Hall, so people treated her mediocrity like a temporary illness money would eventually cure. My place at Reborn came from scholarship auditions, borrowed shoes, and a childhood teacher who wrote letters until the admissions panel got tired of ignoring him. We were both violinists, both in the advanced solo track, both assigned to Professor Soren, but the similarities ended at the surface. Evelyn performed hunger beautifully and never felt it. I felt hunger in my bones and performed discipline because no one forgives a poor girl for wanting too loudly. In my first life, I thought excellence would defend itself. This time, I understood that excellence without evidence is just a rumor waiting to be stolen. So before breakfast, I walked to the media lab and uploaded every marked page of my St. Saëns score to the conservatory's copyright archive, including the pages where I had changed 3 bowings against the standard edition because my fourth finger could not sustain the shift cleanly after an old injury. I scanned the rehearsal notes Professor Soren had written in blue fountain pen 3 weeks earlier. I submitted the file as development materials for Winter Laureate performance, requested a timestamp receipt, copied the automatic confirmation to my external email, and then printed 2 sets, one to keep and one to leave somewhere tempting. When a lab assistant asked why I was smiling, I told him I was nervous. It was not a lie. Revenge, I learned, does not make your hands steady. It only gives the shaking somewhere useful to go. By noon, I had begun placing doors where Evelyn expected walls. I left my marked score on the shared studio piano at exactly the time she took coffee with Mira and Sol from Chamber Ensemble, because in my first life she had returned to the studio alone at 12:18 and photographed the pages under the weak yellow lamp. This time, I made sure the pages looked careless but were not. A thin strip of transparent archival tape ran along the lower edge of each photocopied sheet, dusted with a trace of violet chalk from the stage crew supply cabinet, harmless, invisible unless touched, and very memorable under ultraviolet light. I added 1 false fingering in measure 73, an impossible shift no compen player would choose unless she was copying without understanding. I circled it twice, as if it were my secret. Then I placed my phone in my open case, camera pointed toward the piano, screen black, recording. I did not need her whole face. I needed her hand, her ring, her pearl bracelet, the motion of her sliding each page under her coat sleeve to photograph it. At 12:16, I left the room with my water bottle and made sure to pass Evelyn in the corridor. "You forgot your mute," she said sweetly, lifting the small rubber mute I had never forgotten from her palm. In my first life, I thanked her. In this life, I tilted my head and let surprise cross my face. Keep it for now, I said. I have another. Her smile twitched. She hated when kindness did not bend into dependence. 2 minutes later, while I stood behind the stairwell door listening to my own heartbeat, she slipped into the studio. The phone caught everything. The second thing I did was visit Mr. Halden, the blind piano tuner who knew more secrets about the conservatory than the dean's locked cabinets. Everyone underestimated Halden because he moved slowly, spoke softly, and seemed to belong to the building more than to any person inside it. In my first life, he had found me crying in the loading dock after the disciplinary panel and told me, "Music remembers what people alter." I had thought it was comfort. Now I understood it as instruction. He was sitting beneath the opened belly of the Steinway in Hall C, tuning the high treble with one hand and eating sugared almonds from a paper bag with the other. "Miss Vane," he said before I spoke, "your G-string is sharp when you're upset." I laughed once because the living sometimes do absurd things around ghosts. Then I asked whether the conservatory kept calibration logs for practice room cameras and stage recording equipment. He lifted his head. "That depends on whether you want the official answer or the useful one." I told him I wanted the answer that would survive a committee hearing. He stopped tuning. The hall became very quiet, except for distant scales leaking through the walls like trapped birds. I did not tell him I had died. I told him that someone was going to steal my recital slot, copy my markings, damage her own bow, and frame me for it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he tapped the tuning hammer against his palm and asked one question. "Do you want to prevent it or prove it?" In my first life, everyone had praised my innocence after it was too late to restore anything. In this life, I swallowed the bitterness and answered, "I want proof before prevention becomes mercy." Halden nodded as if I had finally reached the right tempo. Halden's help came in the shape of old keys and older grudges. He had tuned for Veron for 31 years, through 4 deans, 12 donor scandals, and more false prodigies than the promotional office would admit. He knew that the Grand Aurelia Hall livestream system recorded backstage audio 30 minutes before broadcast for safety checks. He knew that the archive cameras outside the registrar's office captured the signing desk from an angle administrators pretended not to remember. He knew that the conservatory's emergency disciplinary review could be triggered by any staff member who submitted evidence of credential fraud affecting a public performance. Most importantly, he knew that Evelyn's previous audition file had already raised suspicion. 3 months before my rebirth, the conservatory had received an anonymous complaint from the Prague Youth Virtuosi competition claiming that Evelyn had submitted a doctored certificate listing herself as finalist when she had only made the waiting list. Veron had buried it because her mother donated funds for the new digital organ. But buried did not mean destroyed. "There is a difference," Halden said, placing a small brass key on the piano lid, between a locked drawer and a forgotten drawer. I stared at the key. "I can't steal records." He gave me a look that made blindness seem irrelevant. "I did not ask you to. I am telling you the head archivist enjoys chamomile tea at 3:40 and forgets the cabinet cart in the hall. You are a scholarship student, Miss Vane. You must learn the difference between crime and walking past an open door with witnesses." It was bad advice if heard by the wrong person. It was perfect advice for a girl who had once been destroyed by people who understood procedure better than truth. That afternoon, I did something my first life never allowed. I performed badly on purpose. At rehearsal with Professor Soren, I played St. Sans as if my nerves were chewing holes through the phrases. I rushed the opening. I clipped the spiccato. I let the high harmonic in the final section squeak just enough to make the accompanist, Adrian, wince. Professor Soren removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. In my first life, disappointing him would have gutted me. His approval had been a North Star. But even stars can be mistaken for lighthouses when you are drowning. "Leora," he said carefully, "you sound tired." Evelyn sat behind him pretending to mark her own score, although her pencil had not moved for 10 minutes. "She hasn't been sleeping," she murmured.
"I'm worried."
The room warmed with sympathy that did not belong to me. I lowered my violin and let my shoulder sag. "Maybe I'm not ready," I said. Professor Soren looked pained. Evelyn's pencil finally moved. "You've earned this slot," he said, but his voice had softened in the wrong direction, from belief to concern. I knew that tone. It was the tone of institutions preparing to make a decision for your own good. I let my eyes flicker to Evelyn, then away, as if ashamed. She leaned forward, exactly as she had in my first life. "No one would judge you for stepping back," she said. "The hall is enormous. The critics are cruel. Sometimes strength means knowing when to rest." I wanted to laugh. Instead, I whispered, "Maybe." Her pupils brightened. In that moment, I understood how predators mistake patience for weakness. She thought she had found the crack. She did not know I was the one holding the chisel. The forged withdrawal form appeared 2 days later. I knew because I watched Evelyn carry it under a pale blue folder into the registrar's office at 9:03 a.m., wearing the sorrowful expression of a saint delivering bad news. I had already positioned myself at the copy station across the corridor, feeding blank paper into the jammed printer while my phone sat upright inside the open lid. Through the glass wall, I saw her speak to Miss Corrigan, the assistant registrar, saw her press a hand to her chest, saw the folder slide across the desk. Corrigan frowned. Evelyn nodded, slowly, tragically. Then she produced what looked like my signature at the bottom of the form. In my first life, that signature had been enough because I had signed dozens of practice room logs, score loans, and scholarship forms in the same hurried slant. This time, the signature was a performance of my handwriting copied from old documents, and I had spent the previous night changing my actual signature on every official filing by adding my full middle initial and a broken underline, witnessed by the finance office clerk who needed me to revalidate my scholarship banking details. When Corrigan scanned the withdrawal form, the system would not match the updated signature record. That alone might delay the process, but delay was not enough. So I waited until Evelyn left the office and nearly collided with me at the printer. Her face flickered, then settled. "Leora," she said. "You startled me." I looked at the folder under her arm, then at her. "Did you submit something?" For half a second, she considered lying. Then she chose the lie that had always worked. "Professor Soren asked me to bring updated rehearsal notes." I let the silence stretch just long enough for the office camera to capture her mouth shaping the words. Then I smiled. How helpful. That evening, the first anonymous email arrived in my inbox before it was sent from my account. That sounds impossible unless you understand how careless rich girls become when they think money is a password. In my first life, an email had gone out from my conservatory account to the Recital committee accusing Evelyn of sleeping with donors, faking competitions, and poisoning the merit system. The language was vicious enough to make every true allegation look like jealousy. This time, I had changed my password, enabled two-step verification, and set automatic forwarding on failed login alerts to an address no one knew. At 7:41 p.m., I received notice of 3 failed attempts from a practice room terminal registered to the West Wing. At 7:48, another attempt came from the library catalog desk. At 7:53, my old password, Evelyn's favorite teacher's name, which I had used when I was foolish enough to think personal details were harmless, was entered correctly, but blocked by the new verification. I sat in the silent reading room watching each alert arrive like a metronome. Then I opened the draft folder of my account and found a message already prepared but unsent because the intruder had not yet obtained final access. Whoever built it had used phrases from my private journal. My stomach tightened. She had not only stolen my score in the first life. She had read the notebook I kept in my violin case, the one where I wrote ugly thoughts after beautiful lessons so I would not say them aloud. The draft accused Evelyn of fraud in exactly the tone of a wounded girl losing control. At the bottom, someone had attached a blurred photograph of Evelyn's Prague certificate. It was true enough to be useful and cruel enough to be dismissed. I saved the draft, exported the access logs, and then, instead of deleting it, I changed one word in the final line. I changed ruin to reveal. It was a small alteration, small enough that the sender might not notice, large enough to prove later that someone had used a draft I had already preserved. The accomplice I had least wanted to believe in was Adrian. He had accompanied me for 2 years, adjusted tempos to my breathing, brought coffee before morning juries, and once walked me home after a late rehearsal because the city buses stopped running. In my first life, I thought he betrayed me because Evelyn paid him. In my second life, I learned the truth was cheaper. She flattered him. That was all. Adrian had lived in the shadow of soloists for so long that the first person to call him artist instead of accompanist earned his loyalty more completely than any bribe. 3 days before the recital, I found him in room D6, rehearsing the St. Sands with Evelyn, although the official schedule still listed him with me. Her playing had improved in the exact places my stolen markings told her what to do and collapsed everywhere between them. Adrian stopped when he saw me in the doorway. Guilt crossed his face before he could lower the lid over it. Evelyn recovered faster. Professor Soren asked me to step in if you withdraw, she said. We're just preparing for the possibility. I wanted to ask Adrian whether he had ever wondered why possibility always favored people with donor parents. Instead, I said, good. The transition should be smooth. Adrian stared at me. You're not upset? I tucked my hands into my coat pockets so neither of them could see the crescent marks my nails had dug into my palms. I'm tired of fighting music, I said. If Evelyn is ready, maybe she should take the stage. That was the sentence she wanted. Her whole face warmed with victory, and Adrian looked relieved enough to prove his spine had already left the room. I stepped back and let the door close before my expression changed. Betrayal is less shocking the second time. It still hurts, but more cleanly, like a needle entering a vein for medicine rather than poison. The next morning, I withdrew for real, but not from the recital. I withdrew from their version of it. I submitted a sealed program amendment to the Laureate Committee under Clause 18.4 of the Student Performance Regulations, a clause almost no one read because it only applied when a performer believed their prepared repertoire had been compromised by unauthorized access, duplication, or conflict affecting artistic integrity. In normal language, it meant if someone stole your piece, you could replace it until 48 hours before curtain, provided the new repertoire had been approved by a faculty sponsor. Professor Soren would never sponsor me while Evelyn was feeding him stage fright stories, so I went to Professor Illermoss, the retired chamber music chair who taught one elective a semester and terrified everyone because she had once told a prince his vibrato sounded like a goat begging for rain. Moss had heard me play Bach in the stairwell 2 years earlier and told me, "You are not brilliant yet, but you are honest, which is rarer." I brought her coffee, the timestamp archive receipt, the copied score video, and a request to approve my replacement piece, Chaconne from Bach's Partita No. 2, unaccompanied. She looked at the documents, then at me, then at the violin case by my chair. "Why Bach?" she asked. "Because no accompanist can betray me in Bach," I said. "And because if they steal St. Sands, I want the hall to hear what they did not steal." Moss smiled without softness. "Good. Play the opening." I played standing in her cramped office between towers of old scores and dead plants. My hands shook at first, not from fear of her judgment, but from the weight of knowing this was the first music in 2 lives that belonged only to me. When I finished the first page, Moss signed the approval form and wrote one sentence beneath her signature. "Performer has demonstrated independent mastery sufficient for substitution." I kept that sentence folded in my pocket like a weapon. Evelyn stole the slot completely that afternoon. The amended program went up with her name in my place, and the conservatory group chat detonated. Some students pitted me. Some mocked me. Some, hungry for drama, pretended concern while asking whether I had really broken down in Professor Soren's studio. I did not defend myself. Public defense was what Evelyn wanted, because every emotional word I spent would become another thread in her costume of victimhood. Instead, I replied to exactly one message from Mira, who asked whether I was okay. "I'm watching," I wrote. Mira sent back a question mark and then, after a full minute, "Do you need help?" I stared at that message for a long time. In my first life, I trusted no one after the trap closed, because betrayal makes even kindness look like rehearsal. In this life, I decided revenge did not have to be lonely to be clean. I met Mira in the instrument locker room after midnight and told her only what she needed to know, Evelyn had copied my score, forged my withdrawal, and would attempt to frame me with sabotage before the recital. Mira listened with her arms crossed and her jaw tightening. She was a cellist, practical and blunt, raised by 2 nurses who had taught her that panic wastes blood. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Not sympathy," I said. "Witnessing." She nodded. "That I can do." Then she opened her locker and took out a tiny clip on camera she used for bow arm practice. "Put this wherever she thinks no one is sentimental enough to look." I almost smiled. "Where's that?" Mira tapped the lid of my old violin case. "Inside the velvet. People steal instruments. They forget cases can remember." The sabotage came exactly when my first life said it would. The morning of the recital, between soundcheck and lunch, when performers left their instruments backstage in the green room under the supervision of a student monitor who believed a clipboard made him official. Evelyn had my old 7 slot, now printed as hers, and I had not yet appeared on the public program because Professor Moss's substitution remained sealed until committee review. In other words, Evelyn thought I had been erased. That made her careless. Mira and I stood in the costume alcove behind a rack of choir robes, watching through a slit between velvet sleeves as Evelyn entered the green room alone. She wore rehearsal flats and a pale blue dress under a cardigan, her hair pinned back with pearl clips. For one moment, she looked young enough that a weaker version of me might have mistaken her for someone frightened by her own ambition. Then she opened my violin case. Not her case. Mine. The case I had deliberately left on the wrong shelf with an old student tag attached, the case I had lined with Myra's camera, the case that held a cheap practice bow already marked with violet chalk from the copied score. Evelyn lifted the bow, removed a small tin from her cardigan pocket, and rubbed something sticky through the hair with quick, angry strokes. Not enough to destroy it visibly. Enough to make it catch and scream on the string. Then she placed the bow back, closed the case, and turned toward the door. Before she left, she whispered something I did not catch until later, when Halden cleaned the audio. "You should have stayed gone." My first life had been full of sentences like that, said when no one important was listening. This time, everyone important would hear them. By noon, the conservatory had become a theater before the theater. Donors arrived in dark coats smelling of expensive rain. Parents posed beneath the marble staircase. Students practiced in bathrooms, stairwells, hall corners, any place large enough for ambition and nerves. The Grand Aurelia Hall glowed gold behind closed doors while stagehands moved chairs and microphones under the supervision of people who believed order meant control. Evelyn moved through it all like a bride, accepting compliments with lowered lashes, touching Adrian's sleeve, hugging Professor Soren as if they had survived a tragedy together. I watched from the balcony lobby in a black dress no one had seen before. It was simple, high-necked, and sleeveless, borrowed from Myra's older sister and altered with pins because I could not afford new clothes for vengeance. My violin rested against my shoulder in its real case, the one I had kept locked under Halden's workbench. Professor Moss stood beside me reading the printed program with open contempt. "They gave her your program note too," she said. I looked down. Beneath Evelyn's name was a paragraph I had written in my first life about St. Sands as an argument between elegance and desperation, about virtuosity not as decoration, but as survival. She had stolen, even the way I explained wanting. I felt anger rise, so fast my throat tightened. Moss folded the program in half. "Good," she said. "Now when the lie burns, the whole page burns with it." It was the closest thing to comfort she offered. It was enough. The emergency review began 37 minutes before curtain, in the small faculty lounge behind the upper boxes, because Halden had submitted the green room footage to the head of performance security, Mira had submitted the score copy video as a witness, and Professor Moss had submitted my sealed substitution request with the copyright archive receipts attached. Committees move slowly when truth threatens donors, but they move very quickly when a public live stream might broadcast fraud with their crest above it. I was called in first. The room smelled of coffee left too long on a hot plate and lilies from the donor reception. Dean Marwick sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and red around the eyes, wearing the expression of a man calculating damage in real time. Beside him were the registrar, Professor Soren, Professor Moss, the student conduct officer, and a woman I did not recognize from the legal office. My first life had ended in a room like this, with people asking why I had not reported concern sooner, why I had handled evidence emotionally, why I had allowed resentment to cloud judgment. This time, I sat with my hands folded. The legal officer asked whether I had deliberately allowed Miss Caro to continue preparing a compromised piece. Yes, I said. Soren flinched. Why? She asked. I looked at Dean Marwick. Because last time I told the truth, everyone asked why I had no proof. The room stilled. Of course, they thought I meant metaphorically. Only I knew I meant an entire life. The registrar cleared her throat and opened the forged withdrawal form. Did you sign this? No. Did you authorize Miss Caro to submit it? No. Did you leave your mark score available for copying? Yes. Dean Marwick leaned forward. Why would you do that? I let the silence sharpen. Because the score was already archived under my name. I wanted to see who would touch it. Evelyn was brought in 10 minutes later, still in her pale blue dress, still carrying the violin she had planned to use to become me. Adrian came behind her, pale and sweating, then her mother, because wealthy parents materialize whenever consequences threaten to become official. Evelyn's face changed when she saw me sitting there. Not much. Just enough for me to understand that she had not expected me backstage, dressed, calm, and alive in the one way that mattered. What is this? Mrs. Caro demanded before anyone could speak. My daughter performs in half an hour. Dean Marwick's smile had the stiffness of old varnish. That is precisely why the matter is urgent. They played the studio video first. On the screen, Evelyn entered after I left, stood at the piano, lifted each page of my mark score, and photographed it beneath the lamp. The room watched her pearl bracelet flash every time she turned a page. Evelyn let out a trembling breath and said, Leora gave me permission. She was overwhelmed and asked me to help prepare a backup. It was a good lie. Familiar, plausible, wrapped in concern. Then the registrar played the corridor video from outside her office, where I asked whether she had submitted something, and Evelyn answered that Professor Soren had asked her to bring updated rehearsal notes. Her own voice destroyed the permission she invented. Professor Soren closed his eyes. Adrian stared at the table. Mrs. Caro said, Students share markings all the time. This is absurd. Professor Moss leaned back. Students do not usually share forged withdrawals, doctored program notes, and sabotaged bows, but perhaps the Caro Foundation has a different curriculum. The legal officer did not smile, but I wanted to. Then came the greenroom footage. That was when Evelyn stopped performing innocence and began performing injury. She watched herself open my case, lift the bow, and drag resin gum through the hair with the precision of someone who had practiced the gesture. When her whisper came through the speakers, "You should have stayed gone," Professor Soren made a sound like someone had struck him in the chest. Evelyn's eyes filled at once. "That was not sabotage," she said. "I thought it was my bow. Our cases look similar. I was fixing it." Mira, called in as witness, gave her a flat look. With rosin glue? The conduct officer asked why she had been carrying a tin not registered among stage supplies. Evelyn said nothing. Mrs. Caro rose from her chair. "You are humiliating a young artist minutes before a major performance based on childish rivalry and hidden cameras." Dean Marwick's face tightened because he had accepted her family's money and now had to pretend it did not sit between them like another witness. "Mrs. Caro, please sit." She did not.
No.
"I want this stopped." That was when the legal officer opened the final folder. Until then, Evelyn had believed the issue was recital misconduct. Serious, yes, but survivable with tears, donations, and perhaps a semester's probation. She did not know the conservatory had already received Prague's corrected certificate log, the one Halden helped me locate, and that the new evidence tied her recital fraud to her original admission file. She did not know Professor Moss had sent the archived timestamps to the External Accreditation Board. She did not know the emergency review was no longer deciding whether she could perform. It was deciding whether she had ever been eligible to stand inside Veron as a student. The revocation of her place at the conservatory happened without shouting, which made it more brutal. Dean Marwick read the statement because no one else wanted their voice attached to the fall of a donor's daughter. Pending full ratification by the Academic Integrity and Admissions Committee, Miss Evelyn Caro is suspended with immediate effect from all public performances, rehearsals, and student privileges due to evidence of falsified competition credentials, forged administrative documents, unauthorized use of another student's performance materials, and attempted sabotage of an instrument or performance aid. Evelyn stared at him as if the words had arrived in a foreign language. "Suspended," she whispered. The legal officer corrected him gently, and that was the first pattern interruption that made even Dean Marwick look startled. "With respect, Dean, the admissions clause is not a suspension matter if the falsified credential materially affected entry and scholarship ranking." She slid a page across the table. The committee chair signed provisional expulsion authority at 4:12 p.m. yesterday after reviewing the Prague confirmation and Miss Vane's archive evidence. Today's hearing concerns the recital, but the academic status is already void pending appeal. Already. The word moved through the room, like a blade pulled from velvet. Evelyn turned to her mother. Mrs. Caro had gone white, not from shame, but from the first realization that money had failed to arrive before consequence. "No," Evelyn said. "No, that's impossible. I'm on the program." Professor Moss looked at the folded paper in front of her. So was Leora. Evelyn finally looked at me then, not with tears, not with fear, but with raw disbelief that I had let her climb all the way to the stage door before showing her there was no stage left beneath her feet. The curtain rose without Evelyn. That was the part nobody knew how to process. Scandal usually stops music. People expect shouting in hallways, canceled performances, statements from administrators, an evening collapsing under the weight of its own gossip. But Professor Moss had planned better than any of them. While the committee removed Evelyn from the building through the service corridor, while her mother threatened lawyers loud enough for the stagehands to hear, while Adrian sat in a chair with his hands over his face because he had followed flattery into professional ruin, the audience in the Grand Aurelia Hall saw only a 3-minute delay, and then Dean Marwick walking on stage with the smile of a man holding broken glass in his mouth. He announced a program adjustment due to an urgent eligibility matter, said Miss Evelyn Caro would no longer appear, and introduced a special performance by Leora Vane, Winter Laureate alternate, playing Bach's Chaconne. I stood in the wings with my violin beneath my chin and felt the old timeline beating against my back like a locked door. In my first life, I had watched the live stream alone in a dorm room I would be forced to leave by morning, my own name scrubbed from the program, my messages unanswered, my hands shaking too badly to hold a bow. This time, the hall was waiting for me. Not kindly, not warmly. Waiting is not the same as welcome. The audience had heard enough whispers to smell blood. They expected a replacement, a victim, maybe a scandal's footnote. I walked onto the stage and gave them neither. The first chord of the Chaconne did not sound like victory. Victory is too thin a word for Bach. It sounded like opening a grave and finding a staircase. My bow sank into the strings, and the hall changed temperature. The Grand Aurelia was built to flatter sound, but it could not fake truth. Every note arrived naked. No piano to soften my breathing. No orchestra to hide behind. No program note stolen from my throat. Just wood, gut, horsehair, and the long argument between grief and structure. At first, my hands wanted to remember fear. The shift in the opening variation almost pulled sharp, and for one terrifying second I saw the platform again, rainwater under my shoes, train lights widening. Then I heard Halden's phrase from the loading dock of my first life. Music remembers what people alter. They had altered my slot, my documents, my story, my reputation. They had not altered my hands. So I played not to prove I had suffered, but to prove suffering had not become my only language. The middle variations rose like a cathedral being built from ash. I let the bass notes bite. I let the high passages gleam without apology. When the major section arrived, bright and impossible, I felt something inside me unclench for the first time since rebirth. It was not forgiveness. I did not forgive Evelyn. I did not forgive Soren for believing tears over evidence, or Dean Marwick for protecting donations until legal risk made truth convenient. What I felt was larger than forgiveness and less gentle. I felt return. I was not reclaiming the recital slot. I was reclaiming the girl who had died believing no one would ever hear the real ending. When the final chord faded, the silence lasted too long for comfort and not long enough for doubt. Then the applause began from the back left, one pair of hands, steady and stubborn. Halden, I thought, though I could not see him beyond the lights. Then Mira stood somewhere near the student section and the sound doubled, tripled, broke open. It was not the polite applause given to a replacement. It was the stunned applause people give when they realize they have been made witnesses to something they cannot reduce to gossip. I bowed once. My hands were cold.
My face was dry.
In the front row, Professor Soren was standing, but I did not look at him long. Teachers who believe you only after proof is blood on it do not deserve the first glance after survival. I looked instead toward the upper balcony where the critics sat with notebooks open, toward the camera light of the live stream, toward the conservatory crest carved above the stage like an old god forced to listen. Then I walked off before the applause finished, because I had learned in my first life that people will take even your exit if you let them turn it into spectacle. Backstage, Professor Moss waited with her arms crossed. "You rushed 2 bars," she said. My laugh came out almost like a sob. I was busy being reborn. She considered that, then nodded once. Acceptable excuse. Do not make it a habit. The aftermath did not unfold as cleanly as stories pretend. Evelyn appealed. Her mother hired lawyers. Dean Marwick released a statement full of polished phrases about integrity, ongoing review, and student welfare, each word designed to hide the fact that Veron had ignored earlier warnings because donations had better acoustics than truth. Adrian wrote me a letter, 3 pages long, apologizing for not asking questions, for liking the way Evelyn spoke to him, for telling himself that my exhaustion made me unreliable. I read it once and placed it in my drawer without answering. Apologies are sometimes sincere and still too late to be useful. Professor Soren asked to meet me the morning after the recital. He looked older, his silver hair uncombed, his office stripped of certainty. "I failed you," he said before I sat down. In my first life, I would have cried because I wanted that sentence so badly. In this life, I only said, yes. He flinched, but he did not defend himself. "I thought I was protecting you. You protected the story that made you feel kind," I replied. "That is not the same thing." He looked at the framed photographs of his prize students on the wall, including one of Evelyn from the autumn masterclass, smiling beneath stage lights she had not earned. "Will you continue studying with me?" he asked. There it was, the old door, open again, familiar and dangerous. I thought of the girl in my first life who would have crawled through broken glass for his approval. Then I thought of Professor Moss calling my rushed bars unacceptable after saving my future. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it did not shake. Soren nodded as if he deserved it.
He did.
3 weeks later, the conservatory held a closed academic assembly to announce the final findings, because institutions love closure ceremonies almost as much as they love avoiding blame. Evelyn's admission was voided. Her scholarship record was removed. Her public performances under Veron's name were marked invalid in the archive. The Prague certificate was confirmed falsified, the withdrawal form was confirmed forged, and the recital sabotage was referred to external authorities as property and conduct misconduct, although I cared less about punishment than about permanence. I wanted records that could not be softened into misunderstanding. I wanted every future room she entered to ask for originals. The assembly hall was crowded with students pretending they had always suspected her. Some of them had mocked me in the group chat. Some had forwarded rumors. Some now smiled as if proximity to my vindication made them brave retroactively. I accepted none of it. When Dean Marwick invited me to speak about resilience, I almost laughed in his face. Resilience was what people praised when they did not want to discuss who had been allowed to hurt you. Instead, I walked to the lectern and unfolded a single page. "I do not want to be described as resilient today," I said, and the hall went so still I could hear someone's bracelet settle against their wrist. Resilience is not an institutional policy. Evidence is. Accountability is. Listening before damage becomes public is. If Veron wants to honor music, it should stop rewarding the best performance of innocence and start protecting the people doing honest work before they are forced to turn their pain into proof. It was not a beautiful speech. It was too sharp for donors, too direct for administrators, too uncomfortable for students who preferred villains to systems.
Good.
Beauty had been stolen from me once and misused as camouflage. I had other tools now. Mira became my friend in the slow way real friendship happens after disaster, not through dramatic loyalty vows, but through ordinary continuance. She saved me a seat in counterpoint. I brought her coffee before orchestra. Halden pretended not to cry when the conservatory finally upgraded the recording archive and named him Technical Integrity Advisor, a title he claimed sounded like a locksmith with delusions. Professor Moss took over my major study and began every lesson by insulting my bow hold with such precision that I trusted her completely. Under her, my playing changed. It became less eager to please and more willing to stand still until the listener came closer. Invitations followed the recital recording after it spread online. A summer academy in Vienna, a masterclass in Paris, a chamber residency I never would have dared apply for in my first life. The world did not suddenly become fair. Some doors opened because scandal made my name searchable. Some people praised me because condemning Evelyn cost them nothing after she fell. But there were also genuine letters from young musicians who had watched the live stream and written, "I thought I was crazy when someone took my work," or "I started saving my drafts because of you," or "I played Bach today." Those messages mattered more than reviews. They reminded me that survival, when witnessed honestly, can become instruction without becoming spectacle. As for Evelyn, I saw her only once after the expulsion. It was late spring, after rain, outside the side entrance of a private arts foundation where I had gone to submit documents for a travel grant. She stood beneath the awning in sunglasses too large for her face, holding a folder with both hands. For a second, the old version of me expected confrontation, tears, insults, a final dramatic plea. Instead, she looked tired. Not humbled, exactly. People like Evelyn often mistake consequences for cruelty long before they reach remorse. She took off her sunglasses when she recognized me. "You ruined my life," she said. There was no audience this time, so her voice had lost its silver. I could have told her that she had built the ruin herself and merely asked me to decorate it. I could have reminded her of the forged form, the sabotaged bow, the stolen score, the whisper in the green room. But some truths are wasted on people who only understand themselves as victims. So I looked at the folder in her hands and asked, "Whose application is that?" Her grip tightened. Color rose in her cheeks, and for one breath I saw the same instinct flicker in her eyes. Not shame, but calculation. Then she turned away. That was answer enough. I walked past her into the foundation office and submitted my documents with originals, copies, timestamps, and witnesses. Rebirth had not made me paranoid. It had made me precise. The night before I left for Vienna, I returned alone to the Grand Aurelia Hall. Halden had given me the key with a grumble about sentimental nonsense, and Professor Moss had told me not to practice too long because planes did not care about artistic breakthroughs. The hall was dark except for the ghost light standing at center stage, a single bulb on a thin pole casting a circle where my feet had once trembled. I carried my violin to that circle and stood there without playing. In my first life, I thought the stage was something to be earned, then something that could be stolen, then something that proved whether I had value. In my second life, I understood the stage was only wood and light. The real performance had always been choosing what kind of person I became when someone tried to turn my silence into their applause. I had let Evelyn steal my recital slot because stopping her at the door would have saved her from the truth of herself. I had let the program print her name because ink can become evidence. I had let the curtain wait because timing, in music and revenge, is everything. But standing there in the quiet hall, with no committee, no audience, no rival, no live stream, I realized the deepest thing I reclaimed was not the slot, or the scholarship, or the public applause. It was the right to play without imagining who might be listening for a flaw to use against me. I lifted the violin and played the opening of the chaconne once more, softer than before, not for proof, not for revenge, but for the girl on the train platform who had believed her song ended there. This time, when the final note faded into the empty gold of the hall, there was no applause. There did not need to be. I was still standing. Before Vienna, there were still practical ruins to clear, and practical ruins are the ones stories always skip because paperwork does not look dramatic under stage lights. My scholarship had to be revalidated because Evelyn's forged withdrawal had triggered an automatic financial review. My practice room access had been frozen for 48 hours because the conduct office, embarrassed by its own incompetence, preferred to investigate everyone instead of admitting the path was obvious. The newspaper from the City Arts desk requested an interview and then sent questions that treated my suffering like a clever marketing angle. How did betrayal shape your artistic identity? Do you consider Miss Caro a tragic figure? Would you perform a duet with her one day as a symbol of healing? I deleted the email twice and restored it twice before Professor Moss walked past my shoulder, read the first question, and said, "They want blood with better grammar. Refuse." So I refused. In my first life, I had thought every chance to explain myself should be taken because silence had been used against me. In the second, I learned explanation can become another performance if the listener only wants the shape of your wound. Instead of interviews, I spent those first weeks in archive rooms, committee offices, and scholarship meetings, making sure every correction was written down. Not promised. Not implied.
Written.
The official recital record had to be amended to show Evelyn was removed for eligibility fraud, not unable to perform. My name had to be restored as feature performer, not alternate. The archive had to attach my program note to my performance and remove it from hers. The conduct file had to state that the bough she sabotaged was planted as part of a documented evidence preservation effort, not left negligently. Each phrase mattered. I had been murdered socially by phrasing once. Concern for emotional stability had meant doubt. Shared repertoire confusion had meant theft. Administrative irregularity had meant forgery with perfume on it. I would not let them bury me under soft words again. My family heard about the scandal from a neighbor before they heard it from me, which was fitting because in my first life they had heard Evelyn's version first too. My aunt had called my mother then, crying that I had attacked a poor girl out of envy, and my mother, who loved me but feared institutions more, had begged me to apologize before things became worse. Worse, of course, had already arrived. This time, when my mother called, her voice held the brittle panic of someone trying to step around a memory she did not know existed. "Leora, people are saying terrible things about that Caro girl," she said. "Are you safe?" That question nearly undid me. Not because it was profound, but because it was late by an entire lifetime. I sat on the floor of my dorm room, surrounded by amended forms and black concert shoes, and told her the smallest truth I could carry without breaking. I am safe now. She went quiet, and I could hear my younger brother arguing with someone in the background about turning the kettle off. Then she said, "I should have trusted you faster." There are apologies that arrive too late and still reach the person they were meant for, not to repair the past, but to stop the next wound from forming. I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said, because I was tired of comforting people for recognizing the obvious. She cried softly. I did not. My tears had belonged to the first life. In the second, I was learning to spend honesty instead. The conservatory tried, briefly, to turn me into a poster. That may sound better than being turned into a villain, but it uses the same machinery. A communications officer named Renata invited me to the administrative suite, offered peppermint tea, and showed me draft captions for a campaign about integrity in the arts. There was my photograph from the recital, taken in the major section of the chaconne, my face lifted toward a light that made me look braver than I felt. Beneath it, they had written, "At Veron, truth always finds its voice." I stared at the line until the words blurred into comedy. "No," I said. Renata looked startled. "We would of course compensate you with media credit." "No. This could help reshape the public narrative." "Whose public narrative?" She folded her hands. "The conservatory's." There it was, finally honest by accident. I slid the paper back across the table. Veron ignored a falsified credential because the student attached to it had a donor family. Veron accepted a forged withdrawal form without calling the performer whose name was on it. Veron allowed a copied program note to be printed under the wrong student. Truth did not find its voice. Evidence dragged truth out by the collar while Veron checked whether the cameras were on. Renata's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. I stood before she found another caption. Use my performance in the archive. Do not use my face to advertise the system that failed me. That afternoon, Professor Moss heard about the meeting from someone who heard about it from someone else and left a note on my studio door. Good. Now practice scales. Revolution is not an excuse for poor intonation. There was also the matter of the students who had watched. I had expected cruelty from strangers, but the aftermath taught me that cowardice often arrives dressed as confusion. Sol, who had repeated Evelyn's stage fright rumor in 3 different group chats, stopped me outside theory class and said, "I hope you know I never meant anything by it." I asked him what he had meant. He laughed once, expecting me to rescue him from the question. I did not. His face reddened. Everyone was saying it. Everyone is not a person, I said. Everyone will not apologize for you. He shifted his folder from one arm to the other and looked down the corridor as if searching for a witness more forgiving than me. I just thought, maybe there were 2 sides. That phrase. 2 sides. People love 2 sides because it lets them stand in the middle and call balance a virtue, while someone else bleeds on the floor.
There were 2 sides, I said.
One had evidence. One had your attention. After that, fewer students approached me with half apologies. More of them simply moved aside when I passed, and I found that preferable. Respect born from fear is not noble, but it is quiet, and quiet gave me room to practice. A week after the assembly, the accreditation board requested my full statement. Not the polished recital version, not the committee summary, but a chronological account of what I knew, when I knew it, and which institutional failures allowed it to continue. The first draft was 30 pages because anger has terrible editing instincts. Professor Moss crossed out entire paragraphs with a red pencil and wrote, "Less poetry, more blade." Halden, who had somehow become the conservatory's unofficial conscience, read the technical section and added camera model numbers, file hashes, archive paths, and access times with the calm pleasure of a man finally allowed to say, "I told you so," in spreadsheet form. Mira read the personal section and circled every place I softened someone else's action to sound reasonable. "You keep saying Soren was misled," she said. "He chose not to verify." I hated that she was right. The final statement was colder than I felt and stronger than what I would have written alone. It named the failures: unchecked donor influence, poor identity verification, informal faculty reporting treated as fact, lack of student notification for withdrawal forms, inadequate evidence preservation training, and a culture where visible distress was mistaken for guilt if it came from a scholarship student and innocence if it came from a wealthy one. Submitting it felt different from performing. Performance carries sound outward. Statement plants weight. I sent it at 11:58 p.m. and slept for 9 hours, the first full sleep I had allowed myself since rebirth. Evelyn's appeal hearing took place behind closed doors, but closed doors have hinges, and Veron's hinges had become very tired. Details reached us in pieces. She claimed emotional coercion, saying she had only taken my materials because I begged her to save the recital. She claimed the forged withdrawal was a misunderstanding caused by my verbal consent. She claimed the Prague certificate had been prepared by her mother's assistant, and she had never reviewed it before submission. She claimed the bow incident was a panic response to discovering sticky residue already present. Each claim died under its own reflection. The archive timestamps showed I had registered my markings before she photographed them. The corridor video showed she lied about the form's purpose. Prague confirmed the certificate file had been uploaded from an email address under her name, followed by a thank you message in her writing. The green room footage showed she brought the residue herself. But the detail that ended the appeal, according to Halden's friend in records, was not the loudest piece of evidence. It was the impossible fingering in measure 73, the false mark I had circled twice. Evelyn had copied it into her own part, then rehearsed it with Adrian, then submitted that copied page as proof I had shared interpretive guidance. Professor Moss apparently laughed so hard the committee chair had to pause proceedings. "No violinist with a wrist would choose this," she said. "Only a thief with a camera." I wish I had seen Evelyn's face when the room understood the trap inside the music. Some punishments are too perfect for witnesses. Adrian's consequences were quieter, which did not mean lighter. He was not expelled because he had not forged documents or sabotaged property, but he lost his recital assistantship, his preferred accompanist status, and Professor Soren's recommendation for the Berlin Collaborative Piano Program. He cornered me once outside the cafeteria with shadows under his eyes and said, "You could tell them I didn't know." The request was so nakedly selfish that I almost admired its lack of disguise. "You didn't know everything," I said. Relief flickered across his face. Then I finished, "But you knew enough to ask." He swallowed. "Evelyn made it sound like you wanted her to step in. And when you found me still practicing the same piece, I thought you were confused." "No," I said. "You preferred me confused. It made your choice, Kinder." He looked away. That was the closest he came to understanding. Later, I heard he had transferred to a smaller academy outside the city and started accompanying singers, where listening mattered more than being seen. I hoped he became better. I did not hope it for him. I hoped it for whoever sat beside him at the piano next. Professor Soren resigned as chair of solo strings at the end of the term, though he remained on faculty with fewer students and a reputation that had lost its shine. The official reason was administrative restructuring. The true reason sat in every corridor conversation. He had allowed a favorite student to manipulate his concern into authority and nearly destroyed another student by mistaking composure for strength and tears for truth. On his last day as chair, he left a small envelope in my mailbox. Inside was the blue fountain pen he had used to mark my St. Sands score, the same pen visible on the archived rehearsal notes that helped prove my ownership. A card read, "This once marked your work. It should return to you." I held the pen for a long time. In my first life, I would have treated it like a relic. In the second, it was just an object with ink inside. I kept it, not because I forgave him, but because tools do not inherit the sins of the hands that use them. The next morning, I used it to mark my Bach. My handwriting looked steadier than I expected. Vienna changed the scale of my world, but not the habits that saved me. I arrived with 3 copies of every acceptance letter, cloud backups of every score, receipts for my violin insurance, and a new rule that no one touched my case unless I was looking at their hands. Some people called it excessive. Those people had never watched their life get rearranged by a forged signature. At the summer academy, I met musicians who did not know the scandal, which was both relief and test. Without the story attached to me, I had to discover whether I still knew how to exist without preparing testimony in every room. The first week, I introduced myself simply as Leora from Veron. No one gasped. No one whispered. A violist from Lisbon asked if I wanted to split laundry detergent. A pianist from Seoul complained that the practice rooms smelled like wet plaster. A cellist from Nairobi told me my Bach sounded angry but organized, which was the first review I truly treasured. Slowly, I stopped scanning every face for hidden motives. Not completely. Perhaps never completely. But enough to laugh when someone missed a cue, enough to eat apricots on the dormitory steps after midnight, enough to play quartet music badly and then better with people who corrected notes without stealing them. Healing, I discovered, is not becoming the girl you were before harm. It is becoming someone who can carry the evidence of harm without letting it conduct every measure. The invitation that mattered most arrived at the end of summer, not from a competition or a critic, but from Veron Student Union. They wanted to establish an independent performance integrity fund for scholarship students who could not afford legal advice, instrument insurance, secure storage, or emergency documentation support. They asked whether I would allow the fund to be named after me. I said no at first because I was tired of my name being attached to institutional guilt. Then Mira called me from the practice courtyard, speaking over the sound of someone murdering Tchaikovsky in the background, and said, "It is not for them. It is for the next person who leaves a score on a piano and thinks talent is enough protection." That landed. So I agreed on 3 conditions. The fund would be student-governed, donor money would not influence case decisions, and every first-year scholarship student would receive training on documentation, digital security, and administrative rights before their first jury. Dean Marwick disliked the conditions. The student union published them before he could negotiate. For the first time, my story became useful without being consumed. The fund bought lockable cases, paid for independent advice, and created a system where withdrawal forms triggered automatic performer confirmation. Small changes. Boring changes. The kind that save lives because they happen before tragedy becomes cinematic. That fund became the first thing in my second life that felt like revenge turning into architecture. Revenge by itself is a match. It illuminates the room for a second and burns your fingers if you hold it too long. Architecture stays after you leave. The first workshop was held in a basement seminar room with bad heating and 32 students packed shoulder to shoulder, most of them scholarship performers, most pretending they had only come because attendance was recommended. Halden stood at the front beside a projector and taught them how to photograph marked scores with timestamps, how to store instrument serial numbers, how to forward administrative confirmations to private accounts, how to ask for written verification without sounding apologetic. Professor Moss followed with a talk called Artistic Generosity is Not Administrative Consent, which should have been printed above every practice room door. I joined by video from Vienna at 2 a.m, hair wet from the shower, hoodie over my concert clothes, and told them the truth I wish someone had told me before my first life shattered. You are not paranoid for keeping records. You are not unkind for asking people to put things in writing. Trust is not proven by handing someone the only copy of your work. Protecting your art does not make it less pure. No one applauded at first. They were too busy writing. That was better. Applause fades. Notes become habits. The strangest part of moving forward was how often joy arrived without asking whether the timing was appropriate. I had expected happiness to feel like a grand reward after justice, something earned in a clean sequence after the villain fell and the institution corrected the record. Instead, it came in ridiculous fragments while the mess was still ongoing. It came when Mira sent me a picture of Halden wearing an official lanyard upside down. It came when Professor Moss emailed only the words your left hand has stopped lying, which from her was practically a love poem. It came when my mother mailed me a box of socks because she had read that Vienna was cold and tucked between them a note saying, "I am proud of the way you tell the truth." It came during a rehearsal when I missed an entrance, laughed instead of apologizing like I had committed a crime, and the quartet simply started again. For years, even before my first death, music had been a narrow bridge over poverty, expectation, and fear. Every note had to carry the weight of escape. After Evelyn fell, after the curtain rose without her, I began to experience music as a place instead of a test. That did not make me softer. It made me harder to steal from, because thieves depend on desperation. A desperate person can be rushed, shamed, flattered, cornered. A person who has learned to stand inside her own life has more time to look at the hand reaching for her pocket. One winter evening a year after the scandal, Veron invited me back to perform as a guest artist in the same Grand Aurelia Hall. I almost refused. Part of me wanted the room to remain sealed in memory. The stolen program, the emergency hearing, the Chaconne rising out of disaster like a verdict. But Professor Moss said, "Do not let a room believe it only gets to hold one version of you." So I returned. The hall looked smaller than it had in my fear, which is true of many monsters when you meet them with sleep, food, and a good lawyer. The student ushers whispered my name, but not cruelly. Halden had polished the stage himself and pretended this was routine. Mira sat in the front row with flowers she claimed were not sentimental because they had thorns. I played a program that began with Bach but did not end there. Clara Schumann, Bachowitz, a new piece by a composer from the Academy in Vienna who wrote rhythms like doors slamming in a storm. Before the final work, I spoke to the audience, not about Evelyn, not about rebirth, not about theft, but about listening. A performance is not only the person on stage, I said. It is everyone who chooses whether to hear what is actually being played or what they expected to hear before the first note. Then I played, and for once the Grand Aurelia was not a courtroom, not a trap, not a grave with velvet seats. It was only a hall. My sound entered it and came back clean. After that concert, a first-year violinist waited by the side door with a cheap black case hugged to her chest. She had bitten her nails to the quick, and when she spoke, the words tumbled out so fast I recognized the old terror immediately. Another student had been asking to borrow her annotated concerto part. A studio assistant had told her not to be difficult. Her teacher had said collaboration required openness. She wanted to know whether refusing would make her look selfish. I could have given her a gentle answer about boundaries. Instead, I opened my bag, gave her one of the spare archive envelopes I still carried out of habit, and said, "Make a copy. Register it. Then decide what generosity you can afford." She stared at the envelope like it was a talisman. Maybe it was. Not magical, not dramatic, just paper designed to prove sequence. I kept that envelope in my memory longer than any review because it proved the lesson had traveled beyond me. As she walked away, I understood that the most important curtain had risen long after Evelyn was removed from the stage. It rose every time another girl learned that being talented did not require being undefended. Years later, when people asked about the Winter Laureate scandal, they always wanted the clean version. They wanted to hear that justice arrived like a perfect cadence, that the guilty were punished, that the innocent were restored, that talent triumphed because truth has better pitch than lies. I never gave them that version. Clean stories are dangerous. They teach wounded people to blame themselves when rescue arrives late, incomplete, or not at all. The truth was messier. I survived because I remembered pain with enough detail to turn it into preparation. I won because I stopped begging liars to confess and started building rooms where their lies had to echo back in their own voices. I healed because I chose teachers who corrected me instead of owning me, friends who witnessed instead of consuming me, and music that did not require my destruction to sound profound. Sometimes, in interviews, a journalist would ask whether I regretted letting Evelyn get so close to the stage. They expected nobility, perhaps a line about compassion. I always thought of her standing behind the curtain in the pale blue dress she wore like stolen dawn, believing she had finally become the girl everyone would applaud. Then I thought of the dean reading the expulsion notice before she could take a single step into the light. No, I would say. A curtain is not only something that rises. Sometimes it is the last wall between a lie and the audience it tried to fool. And when they asked what I learned from being reborn, I never mentioned destiny. I mentioned locks, timestamps, witnesses, and Bach. Destiny is what people call timing when they do not see the work behind it. I saw the work. I did the work. Then I let the curtain rise without her.